Just past 7:30 p.m. across India, live from New Delhi. You're watching DD India Global. We will get you the top stories from India and the region. I'm Anil Thomas. And for news from the rest of the world, I'm joined by my colleague in Washington, D.C., Nick Harper. Nick, what are the stories that we have today?
Good morning, Anil. It's 10 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. It's 3 in the afternoon across Central Europe. Coming up in the next 30 minutes, Hamas proposes a truce that Israel rejects. We'll have the latest from our correspondent in Israel. And more than a dozen people have been killed in a missile strike in Ukraine. But first, the headlines.
Israel rejects Hamas truce offer, calling it unrealistic. First ship carrying humanitarian aid reaches the Gaza coast. India rejects US CAA remarks as misplaced, unwarranted. MEA puts CAA as country's internal matter. Russian President Vladimir Putin eyes re-election amid Ukraine conflict and the absence of credible opposition. NATO calls polls not free and fair. India's Ministry of External Affairs spokesperson Randeep Jaiswal briefed the media in New Delhi on Friday. Addressing the media, Jaiswal emphasized India's Citizenship Amendment Act 2019 as an internal matter and in alignment with India's inclusive traditions and its commitment to human rights.
The Citizenship Amendment Act 2019 is an internal matter of India and is in keeping with India's inclusive traditions and a long-standing commitment to human rights. The Act grants a safe haven to persecuted minorities belonging to Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi and Christian communities from Afghanistan, Pakistan and Bangladesh who have entered India on or before 31st December 2014. The CA is about giving citizenship, not about taking away citizenship. So this must be underlined.
MEA spokesperson also underscored that Indian embassy is in constant touch with the Indian community amidst the crisis in Haiti.
We have established a control room here in the Ministry of External Affairs. We have emergency helpline numbers. Our embassy in Santo Domingo in Dominican Republic, which has the accreditation for Haiti, has also established a control room, has also established helplines. There are some 50 to 80 Indian community members there. The embassy is in touch with all of them. We are monitoring the situation. As you know, there is a crisis in Haiti, and if required, we will evacuate. We are ready to evacuate, and if required, we will do that. Our embassy in Santo Domingo is monitoring the situation, and the ministry also is fully monitoring the situation.
Well, in view of the ongoing crisis in Haiti, a 24-hour control room has been set up in India's Ministry of External Affairs to monitor the situation and provide information along with assistance. In addition, a 24-hour emergency helpline has also been set up. People in Haiti, meanwhile, rushed to the border with the neighboring Dominican Republic to stock up supplies amid a worsening humanitarian crisis. Access to trade market on the Dominican border has been limited to 2 days a week as unrest continues. The political situation in Haiti hangs in limbo after Prime Minister Ariel Henry announced his resignation on Monday. Gang violence has swamped the Caribbean country with a shootout in one neighborhood and an attack on the police academy early on Thursday. A local gang leader has also sent threatening messages to political leaders who would lead a transitional council.
Of a lack of diesel on the Haitian side.
Well, news from West Asia now. As the conflict enters day number 160, Israel has rejected the latest Hamas counteroffer to ceasefire proposal, citing unrealistic demands. Nick Harper is in Washington and gives us more on this and other stories making headlines from around the world. Nick, the truce by Hamas being rejected by Israel. What's next for the people in the conflict zone?
Well, that still remains unclear because in the latest from the Israel-Hamas conflict, Israel has rejected Hamas's proposal of a Gaza ceasefire. Hamas presented mediators with the latest counteroffer for a weeks-long ceasefire, but it was rejected by Israel, who said it was based on unrealistic demands. Hamas's latest proposal to mediators mentioned the first stage of releasing Israeli women, children and the elderly, and also proposed to release 6 hostages in exchange for the release of 700 to 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. Well, amid these stepped-up efforts to reach a deal for a truce, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has convened a war cabinet meeting at the IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv. Prime Minister Netanyahu's office said he had approved plans for an operation in Rafah, in the Gaza Strip, and an Israeli delegation will leave for Doha after the cabinet meeting. Meanwhile, relatives of hostages who are still being held in Gaza protested in Tel Aviv outside the venue of the cabinet meeting. The families called on the cabinet to close a deal on the release of hostages at the earliest.
We expect the Israeli government to do what it needs to do and close this deal and bring all the hostages back. That's money time.
We can't leave them there. We just can't. This is our family. This is my blood, okay? These are my people, and we cannot desert them there. This is not what this country stands for.
Humanitarian aid supplies from both air and water routes have reached Gaza on Friday after Israel rejected the latest truce offer by Hamas. One vessel loaded with 200 tons of food, of aid, from which supplies are expected to be delivered to Gaza by jetty. It's been arranged by the World's Central Kitchen, the shipment being part of a pilot project to open a new sea corridor. Meanwhile, preparations are underway for a second Gaza-bound aid ship to depart from Cyprus. If the new sea route is successful, it may help to ease the problems in Gaza. Well, DD India's Alex Kadia is joining us live from Jerusalem. Alex, there's been some movement in the ceasefire talks. What are you hearing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Nick. The latest we have is we've got a response now, or at least some form of response by the Israelis to this new counter-proposal by Hamas. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, his office, has approved Israeli negotiators travelling to Doha in Qatar to continue the negotiations on this deal. Now, certainly that is not accepting Hamas's terms at all, something that Benjamin Netanyahu has called unacceptable. They don't find he even called these proposals ridiculous. But it does show that Israel is now going back to the table. They did not send negotiators to Cairo last week. They are now sending negotiators to Doha. That means that the negotiations can keep moving forward. Now, I'll remind you of the terms of the counter-proposal by Hamas. You mentioned them just a moment ago. Women, elderly and injured hostages will be released in exchange. Hamas asks for 700 to 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. They also want this to be the first phase of a series that will lead to a permanent ceasefire, as well as the complete removal of Israeli troops from Gaza. Now, those two things are not something Israel will even begin to consider, but certainly the fact that Israel is going to Doha to continue these negotiations, clearly showing that there is some forward movement on these ceasefire talks. Nick?
And Alex, that first ship carrying aid has now arrived in Gaza, but really how much of an impact is that going to make on the ground for the people there?
Well, that individual ship will have minimal impact just for the sheer scale of the humanitarian crisis there. We know the United Nations says 500,000 people in Gaza are on the verge of famine. You have 1.5 million people in the city of Rafah. You have 500,000 people in central Gaza, 300,000 people in the north of Gaza. All of those areas very badly affected by this war. But that first ship is that first pilot program for the maritime corridor, on which some hopes are pinned. Of course, that maritime corridor where larger ships will be able to arrive with much, much larger amounts of aid once it comes through. And particularly once the United States has built its temporary pier. That's about 2 or 3 days away now, and certainly that will possibly have an impact. Now, of course, a lot of aid agencies on the ground say, well, one of the ways you could do this right now is by opening up some of the checkpoints around Gaza and allowing a lot more aid to come in by road and by land. That is the most efficient, the fastest way to get that aid. But at the moment, there are still some frictions and there's still some slowdowns by those Israeli security checks on the way in by road, and so the amount is limited. It is a start. It is that pilot program. It will not have an immediate impact, but it certainly could be the start of something that brings quite a bit of hope to the people of Gaza. Nick?
Alex, thank you. That was Alex Carrier joining us live from Jerusalem. Well, staying with the Israel-Hamas conflict, and in a recent video released by the Israeli army, troops can be seen engaging in ground operations against Hamas. The army also carried out aerial strikes on Hamas targets. The Israeli soldiers were operating in the area of Khan Yunis in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, where they say they eliminated Hamas terrorists by tank and by sniper fire. Well, moving on now, at least 14 people were killed and 46 injured in a missile attack in Ukraine's southern port city of Odessa. The local administration said there were 2 waves of attacks that injured several relief workers while they were carrying out rescue work after the first strike. Infrastructure and vehicles were also damaged in the attack. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz welcomed French President Emmanuel Macron in Berlin on Friday. Both leaders met for bilateral talks ahead of a meeting together with their Polish counterpart, Donald Tusk. Scholz is hosting the French and Polish counterparts in a bid to project European unity on support for Ukraine after weeks of tensions between the allies. Earlier today, European Council President Charles Michel also held talks with the German Chancellor in Berlin on the ongoing conflict and the Russian presidential elections. Meanwhile, the Kremlin on Friday commented on French President Emmanuel Macron's remarks about the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that France was already involved in the conflict and had now signalled it was ready for deeper involvement.
The fact that Russia is advisory for France. Yes, this is absolutely clear, because France is already involved in the war in Ukraine. In fact, it is indirectly participating in this war. And judging by the statements of the president, he is not opposed to increasing his level of involvement.
Well, earlier on Thursday, Macron called Russia an adversary that would not stop in Ukraine if it defeated Kiev's troops in the now more than 2-year-old conflict. Macron has warned that Europe should prepare for war if it seeks peace.
Il y a 2 ans, nous disions jamais on enverra de chars.
If the war were to spread in Europe, it would be Russia's only choice and responsibility. But to decide, us today, to be weak, to decide today that we would not respond to it, is already to be in defeat. But that I do not want.
Escalade, nous ne sommes pas en guerre contre la Russie.
Well, Russia's presidential elections are underway, with Friday marking the first of 3 days of voting. Incumbent President Vladimir Putin is all but certain to win against 3 challengers, none of whom have criticised him. Putin's popularity is also high amid strong support for Russia in their conflict with Ukraine. Putin's approval rating is currently at 86%, up from 71% shortly before the invasion of Ukraine. That's according to Levada Center, a Russian polling company. Meanwhile, voting is also underway in Ukrainian regions annexed by Russia during the conflict. DD India's Dasha Chanashova reports from Moscow.
Well, obviously, it is an important legitimizing exercise for the Russian authorities as it is seen by the international community. But domestically, it is an important opportunity for the Russians to exercise their civic duty, as President Putin has put it forward. So we understand that the turnout by this hour has exceeded 7% nationwide. We have seen people coming to the polling stations like this one here in the Russian capital, all pretty much in a positive mode, saying that they do have to come here and to cast their ballot, but they also have an opportunity to do that online. This is one of the novelties of this presidential election. It is not only being held not just for one day but for 3, but also online, and we understand that many have used this opportunity. At the same time, we understand that voting is underway in the so-called new territories of Russia, where people have an opportunity to both come to the polling stations, or they have had a chance to cast their ballot with the mobile teams coming to their houses. It has been criticized by some of the international community, but as we hear from the observers who have been commenting to the Russian media here domestically, they have not reported any major irregularities. Another important issue is obviously that Russians do say that they want to continue with the stability they have seen in their country over the course of the past years, and that's why we understand the approval ratings of the incumbent presidents are very high. The turnout is expected to reach 70% by the end of the third day of the voting, and obviously the incumbent president Vladimir Putin is expected to win this election with a vast majority.
To US News now, and a federal judge has denied the request of former US President Donald Trump in a case of illegally holding on to classified documents after he left the White House. The ruling came just hours after a hearing in which Trump's lawyers argued that the central charge in the case is improperly vague. The defence team based their arguments on the President's Records Act, which requires officials to hand back documents when they leave office. Well, that's it from me here in Washington. Anil, back to you in the studio.
Thank you, Nick, for those updates. Well, still to come on DD India Global. Election Commission of India to announce schedule for general elections on Saturday. Fast food giant McDonald's technology outage disrupts services worldwide. Rules out cyber security breach.
Why have the big 5 powers of the United Nations Security Council seen no change in 8 decades? Who is stalling reform of the world body, and for how long can we wait? Are we truly alone in the universe, or are there aliens who keep playing hide and seek with us? Watch Connecting the Dots to get the full picture every Friday at 8 p.m. IST on DD India.
You're watching DD India Global. I am Anil Thomas. The Election Commission of India will announce the schedule for this year's general elections on Saturday. The media briefing will be live streamed on social media platforms of the Election Commission of India at 3 p.m. IST or 9:30 GMT. Staying with the Election Commission, the newly appointed election commissioners Gyanesh Kumar and Sukhbir Singh Sandhu took charge of office on Friday. They were appointed as election commissioners by the selection panel led by the Prime Minister and comprising Leader of Main Opposition in Lok Sabha and a Union Minister. The 2 vacancies were created in the Election Commission after the retirement of Anup Chandra Pandey in February and the resignation of Arun Goel recently days ahead of the Lok Sabha polls. The new commissioners have joined their offices to help the poll body conduct these elections. While global overall human development index value is greater than it was 5 years ago, UNDP report reveals that rich countries attained record human development, but half of the poorest still remain below their pre-crisis level of progress. DD India's Jessica Taneja spoke with a resident representative of United Nations Development Programme, Kathleen Vizay.
We're living in a time where seeing global conflicts take place both in Ukraine as well as the Middle East, and also COVID-19, it left quite an impact. There were a lot of countries in the global south that were not able to cope with the pressures. How do these countries prepare better for external shocks, and what kind of help do they need in terms of improving their human development index?
So, very good question. And I think one of the findings of the Human Development Report this year is that the recovery from COVID was very unequal. And the countries that were wealthier did better, and the countries that were poorer did worse, and that there's a growing divide. The important takeaway for India was the use of digital infrastructure. And the digital infrastructure, India's been a forerunner in adapting this, and I think the report highlights, some of the successes with the utilization of the India Stack, so-called India Stack, that during COVID was able to, deliver benefits to those who are very vulnerable during the crises. Also, together with UNDP, there was a development of a digital platform called CoWIN. And CoWIN was a way of tracking all the vaccine supply chain and ensuring the registration of all those who had taken the vaccine, and enabled India to deliver 2 billion vaccines within its borders. So I think this was an extraordinary experience. And during that time, also India was a bridge, providing vaccines to many different countries.
Well, India's Minister of Commerce and Industry, Piyush Goyal, addressed a press conference at the recently inaugurated Bharat Ratna Mega Common Facility Centre in the Indian city of Mumbai. In its address, the Union Minister highlighted the impetus given to the electric vehicle industry in India and the job creation potential of this sector through startups and MSMEs.
E-vehicle policy to promote India as a manufacturing destination for electric vehicles. तो मुझे आप सबसे साझा करते हुए बड़ी खुशी होती है कि दुनिया भर से अब हम आमंत्रण कर रहे हैं कि लोग भारत आए, भारत में तेज गति से इलेक्ट्रिक व्हीकल्स का उत्पादन बढ़े, प्रोडक्शन बढ़े और हम विश्व शक्ति बने। भारत से पूरी दुनिया में भारत की बनी हुई इलेक्ट्रिक व्हीकल्स, टाटास की हो, महिंद्रास की हो और दुनिया भर के जो भी यहाँ आना चाहे, सब लोग भारत में बनाए, भारत में बड़ा इकोसिस्टम बने, पार्ट्स का, डिजाइन का, ऑटो कंपोनेंट्स का, बैटरी बनाने का, लाखों लोगों को नए रोजगार के अवसर मिले।
Meanwhile, in the last 11 months, India's overall goods trade has been at $709.81 billion. India's merchandise exports in February 2024 stood at $41.4 billion against $37.1 billion year on year. Goods imports stood at $60.1 billion. India's merchandise trade deficit in February stood at $18.7 billion. Economists had expected the country's February trade deficit to be $18.3 billion. Overall, exports to the US has been significantly higher. India has replaced China and Taiwan in terms of exports of smartphones to the world and the US in particular. A quick look at other stories making news around the world. Germany agreed to a new European Union law to cut packaging waste and ban single-use plastic in Brussels on Friday. The law aims to help the German packaging industry, the labeling industry, and all 27 EU members to make significant progress in using reusable packaging and dealing with plastic waste. Pope Francis gave readings at the plenary audience of the Dicastery for Evangelization on Friday. The 87-year-old delegated the task to an aide as he was still suffering from a cold. Pope Francis' recent bout with flu and bronchitis began earlier in Feb when he was forced to cancel meetings for several days. South Korean actor Oh Young-soo, who starred in the hit Netflix series Squid Game, was convicted on charges of sexual harassment on Friday. The 79-year-old actor was sentenced to 8 months in prison and has been suspended for 2 years. Oh Young-soo was charged with 2 counts of sexual harassment in 2017. At least 3 people were killed and many injured after a swarm of tornadoes reportedly ripped through Indiana and Ohio in the US on Thursday. One of the reported twisters caused heavy damage to homes and businesses in the region, where first responders soon arrived to find injuries along with fatalities. Well, that's all for this edition of DD India Global. But let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. You can connect with us on Facebook, X and Instagram. You can also visit our website, that's ddindia.co.in. We're going to be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Anil Thomas from all of us here in Delhi. Thanks for watching DD India Global.